It's about time I finally got around to Sin and Punishment. I've heard nothing but good things about these games for, like, ever. And, like, they're by Treasure, and Treasure used to make really sick, awesome action games back in the day, like Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier and all that. And I don't know why, it's just taken me forever, but I finally played Sin and Punishment, and it was really cool. There's not a whole lot out there like Sin and Punishment. I guess you could say that Wild Guns and those types of, like, gallery shooters are kind of similar. But Sin and Punishment kind of takes that style of gameplay and pushes it, like, all the way as far as it could possibly go, and then it makes it all treasury and cool, and there's a boss fight every, like, 15 seconds, and it's stylish, and, you know, they just do all the treasure cool stuff that they always do in their games, and it's really neat. So what you got going on in this game is, it's a shooter, of course, but it's an N64 game, so you ain't shooting with two sticks and, you know, traditional shooting like we know nowadays, no. You don't control the camera at all. In fact, most of Sin and Punishment is like an auto-scroller. You control your character, and then separately you control the aiming reticle that dictates where your character is going to shoot. So you kind of got to be a little bit wide-eyed playing this game, making sure that your aiming reticle is on enemies and you're shooting them, but also that you're successfully dodging attacks and stuff, which is surprisingly not too hard. I guess it helps that they don't throw too much craziness at you in this game. It is an N64 game after all. They got some hardware limitations that they're working with. They can't just throw 9 bazillion enemies on the screen. So generally the action is pretty tame in this game. It's not a very hard game, I should say. In fact, I don't think I died a single time playing through it. It's also incredibly short. Like, it's like 1 hour long, tops. But that's fine, it's still good. Anyway, so for controlling your character, you can move left and right, obviously. You can jump, double jump. You got an invincible dash left and right. You can shoot, and if an enemy is up close to you, you can tap the shoot button, and you'll do a melee attack. And because it's a treasure game, and it's all about awesomeness, you can also melee certain enemy projectiles, like missiles and stuff, and they'll launch back at enemies wherever your targeting reticle is at. And that's really cool. And really, that's it for mechanics. Sin and Punishment is not complicated. It's very straightforward and simple. It's just cool shooting action fun for an hour, and it's very stylish and awesome. I mean, just fucking look at what's going on the screen right now. Like, this is crazy. This is madness. Especially for an N64 game. Like, holy shit, dude. This is fucking cool. The character models are incredibly low poly and fugly as hell, but that's fine because it actually means that this game runs at a decent frame rate, which for a 3D game of the time, that's pretty impressive. There's really nothing else to say about the gameplay. It's simple, but it's cool and it's fun. And as I said, it's a treasure game, so that means it's boss fight after boss fight after boss fight. The levels or the enemies in between are like your breaks between the main courses. Though I do gotta say, they make those breaks really, really enticing because this is a very, very pacey game. You're constantly being thrown into new scenarios, new situations, and they're very quick to alter the gameplay in some kind of way. Sometimes the camera is behind your back, you're running forward, chasing after a guy, you gotta do a little bit of platforming. Sometimes you're a giant mecha thing fighting a giant Satan monster thing in hell or whatever's going on, and now you're all souped up with more powerful attacks and dashes and stuff, and it's just a really cool sequence. Then you got side-scrolling sections, and you got top-down sections where you're moving around, shooting at stuff. It's very neat. There's a lot of variety in this game. I appreciate it. They really do a lot to make this simple gameplay very different and entertaining and last the whole hour that the game goes on for. One thing that did throw me through a loop in this game is that Sin and Punishment was never released in the West over here. It only came out in Japan. But the game is fully dubbed in English. It's not in Japanese. There's subtitles, but the characters actually speak all in English. And the dub is absolutely terrible, of course. But you can totally understand the story just by watching the cutscenes because everyone's speaking in English. Though, I'm gonna be honest. I'm not 100% sure what's going on in the story of this game. Like, something about like an alien invasion of Earth, and you're on like one side that's trying to do something with the girl, and there's the other guys, the army, that's trying to stop you because something, and I don't really know what's happening. They just kind of like throw you in the middle of things, and they don't explain anything, and that's fine, because who really cares? I just want to shoot stuff. But there are cutscenes. They happen. I watch them. And I guess there's a story, technically. So upon finishing Sin and Punishment, I, of course, went on to the sequel, Sin and Punishment Star Successor. And this game came out way, way, way later than the first one did. This is a Wii game, and so things are pretty different. So controls are pretty much exactly the same as it was before, but now you got a charge shot you can do that has a cooldown on it that does like a big explosive blast, and that does a lot of damage. And you can fly now, and while you're flying through the air, you can just move however you want, doesn't matter. There's no limitations to your flying or anything like that. You can just fly whenever you want, as much as you want, and when you're flying, you can do the invincible dodge in any direction. So because this is a Wii game, you can of course control it with the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and use the pointer of the Wii Remote to specifically aim the cursor exactly where you want it to be, and of course that's going to be a lot more precise and faster than it is going to be using a traditional control scheme like in the first game. But since I had just come off the first game, I was feeling comfortable with that control scheme. So for the gameplay that I have recorded here, I was playing with traditional controls using the right stick to move the aiming reticle around. And it certainly worked, but as you get later into the game when things start to get harder, you really start to feel the limitations of trying to control this aiming reticle with a stick. So I eventually switched over to Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and yeah, that is like 1,000 times better for controlling this game. And yes, when the game gets harder, I said, because unlike the first game, Sin and Punishment Star Successor actually gets pretty challenging in the later parts of it, and it's also way longer. Like, this time around the game is closer to like 4 or 5 hours instead of, 1. So it's basically just Sin and Punishment again, but way longer and more challenging and more gameplay mechanics and all that stuff, and that's really cool. But I don't like it. I'm pretty sure I'm in the extreme minority here when it comes to Sin and Punishment fans. I'm pretty sure it's like universally agreed upon that the second game is better because it basically just fixes all the problems that the first game had and then does it even better and cooler. But I actually don't really like Star Successor very much. And I was really baffled as to why that was, because you look at it on paper and everything just seems better. But I got a number of problems with this game, actually. The first one being the flight that you can do. I feel like being able to fly really hampers the design of the enemy patterns of the attacks and stuff that they throw at you, because now you can kind of just like circle strafe, and that will avoid a lot of enemy attacks for a majority of the game. And there's just so much shit that they throw at you in this game. Like, remember what I said about the first one, how it was an N64 game? They couldn't fill the screen with that much stuff? Yeah, that's not the case anymore. They now throw a bazillion fucking things at you, and towards the end of the game especially, holy fuck, the amount of things you have to avoid, and with all the effects going on the screen and all the lasers and bullets flying everywhere, it gets really hard to see. And so with the flying, you just end up kind of weaving left and right, up and down, all through all these attacks, and it just feels very, like, passive. Like, it gets to a point where I stop paying attention to my character, really, and I kind of just, like, wiggle the stick up, down, all around, and that ends up avoiding attacks a lot of the time until it gets, like, super duper hard in, like, the last 2 levels. In the first game, you could really pay attention to both your character and the aiming reticle very well, and avoid all of the attacks by seeing the attacks incoming and then dodging them, or moving out of the way, or jumping over them. But here, you just kinda move around, and you'll avoid most things, and whatever. Alternatively, when things do finally pick up, and now the enemies are throwing some real difficult attack patterns at you that you're gonna have to precisely dodge, usually they take out the element of aiming for those sequences a lot of the time. where your target's either going to move very little or not at all, so you can just put the aiming reticle on them and maybe lightly follow here and there, or sometimes just leave it there, and you can focus entirely on dodging. And that, to me, is completely disregarding one of the most fun elements of the first Sin and Punishment, which was the multitasking you had to do of making sure you were shooting enemies and dodging attacks at the same time. And as I said, that game did that very well. This game doesn't do that very much at all. It's either all dodging or all shooting. And you can kind of just cruise control whatever's not the main focus right now. And another thing is that, especially during the later boss fights of the game, they do not telegraph their attacks very well in this game at all. Like, there are so many attacks and things that come at you in this game that you're never going to be able to avoid the first time around, because you have no idea what the enemy or the boss or whatever is about to do. The only way to avoid an attack is to already know what that attack is by getting hit by it before. So I ended up taking a lot of really bad-feeling deaths that I just was not having fun with during the later parts of the game. But in the earlier parts of the game, as I said, because you're just like floating around, just moving up, down, left, right, it's just kind of boring when it's easier. The game also, by being longer, it really overstays its welcome, in my opinion. Like, while there are a couple more mechanics going on here, it's ultimately still a very, very simple game. And now being 4 or 5 hours long, it just kind of drags on, man. Like in the first game, because it's only 1 hour, it is just compact. There is as much action shoved into that 1 hour as they possibly could, but here, you end up doing these really, really, really long sequences of, like, lots of flashy flying through environments, but not actually being attacked by enemies, where you're just, like, shooting at birds flying by or whatever creatures they are, whatever. And when you do get to, like, an enemy sequence or some kind of cool moment in the game, they really drag that on, where they just keep having you fight the exact same encounter over and over and over for, like, minutes on end before we slowly transition to the next thing, and then that drags on going over and over and over for minutes on end again. And again, that is in very stark contrast to the first game that was always changing things up. Boss fights were very quick. Any gameplay sequence was generally pretty quick before it transitioned to something else, either a new format of enemies that you had to deal with, or we would switch perspective, or a new boss would show up that you would have to fight in some different way. But here, like, for example, check this level. Probably, like, the first 75% of this level is done in side-scrolling. And you enter this facility here, and for the next fucking, I don't even know how many minutes, you're just fighting these robots that keep coming up in the foreground with the turrets in the background, and they just keep coming more and more and more as the screen very slowly pans over until you get to the next sequence. That is also going to go on for way longer than it should. There's still lots of boss fights, but even then, the boss fights are either kinda dull and boring, like I said, when they're easier, and when they're harder, they're throwing at you all kinds of, like, unfair attacks that you couldn't avoid the first time through, and there's especially this one fucking boss in the second to last level where it suddenly stops being like a shooter at all. People who have played this game know I thought that boss fight was fucking terrible. Like, ugh, that was just miserable to fight. I hated it. And to be honest, I didn't even finish Star Successor. I got to the last level, and I was playing through it, and I was just boss after boss of unfair attacks, and not having that much fun, and really, really long sequences that were really difficult, in a fair way, but again, it was just kind of not that interesting to try to avoid the enemy patterns and stuff, and I just got bored and tired and fed up with it, man. Don't know what to tell you. Although, again, this game has a story, and now this one is really weird. So this game did come out in the West, and so it has an English dub, but in Japan, it has a Japanese dub, and it doesn't have the English dub available. So I'm not sure, like, the first game, it was like artistic intent, I guess, to have the character speaking English. But now in the original Japanese, they're speaking Japanese? And we get it in English? I played it with Japanese audio because I felt that would be more correcter because the Japanese version is in Japanese? But I'm not really sure. It's very confusing. It's hard to tell. Especially when they, like, flash back to things in the first game and they're, like, you know, reiterating lines from other characters, but now it's in a different language. But it would have been in a different language even in the original languages? I'm very confused about, like, what language this series is supposed to be in. But again, it doesn't really matter, because the story, again, is like, I don't really know what's going on. There's more nonsense. Again, there's, like, an alien invasion, and there's a girl, and they want her for some reason, and you don't want them to have her, so you shoot at them all. And, I guess there's technically a story, but who cares? You're just playing this to shoot at things. And that's my thoughts on the Sin and Punishment series. Again, I'm probably an outlier. I think most people are gonna say that Star Successor is way better than the first Sin and Punishment, but it was just not for me, man. I just had too many issues. I think the first Sin and Punishment is a cool little 1-hour thrill ride, and the second one, I don't know, maybe it's more for people that like these types of shooting games, like light gun games and stuff. I'm not really a fan of that kind of genre in general, and this is very similar, but this is more of, like, I guess you could say, a full realization of the first Sin and Punishment's idea as a game. The first one is almost kind of like a proof of concept sort of thing, but I don't know, I ended up liking that more. The first one is definitely cool. If you like it, I would recommend still trying the second one, because I think most people will enjoy it, but just didn't click with me. Oh well.